First of all, I wanted to thank you for coming here tonight, and to thank Betsy for favoring us. What you probably don't know, or at least doesn't make much difference to the world at large, is Betsy is a product of William Mitchell College of Law. She's not only a former student, but also a former adjunct faculty member, and so we're very pleased that those of us who are associated with William Mitchell can contribute to reclaiming democracy in our country. Now, Betsy, I think you probably know a good deal about from her writings in a number of national publications. You also know, of course, of the recent impact of her book. But I want to remember that Betsy, in moments like this, have not always been possible within the last several years. Some of you, I think people in the Merion Park group asked me to come and speak a couple times in the early days after 9/11. And you may remember that the Star Tribune published an op-ed piece saying that, in fact, it was September 27th, saying that Congress has to stop Justice's power grab, the Patriot Act. Well, after that op-ed piece and the posting of the Support the Troops, Bring Them Home sign in my front yard, I caught all kinds of hell from all kinds of places, from all kinds of people. And I'm happy to say that, lo, these many years later, there are now signs up across our block that say, bring the troops home, support the troops, and people like Betsy de la Vega, a former U.S. attorney, is traveling the country explaining to all of us how the fourth branch of government needs to take its stand. Now, we've always heard about the three branches of government. It's a lie. There are four. If you remember, the Declaration of Independence said that those branches of government derive their just powers from whom? The people. It's the fourth branch of government that has always protected our rights. It's the fourth branch of government that has always protected and enlarged democracy. And it's the fourth branch of government that will save us now, with help from people like Betsy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Peter and Ann, and all of you from Merion Park Neighbors for Peace. I wish we could have a similar Neighbors for Peace in every neighborhood around the country. That would be absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to bring back your model to California and see what I can do. Krista was saying this morning, or at lunchtime, talking about Molly Ivins, who our beloved writer who passed away, and one of the points she made was that in all this work and all this activist work, it's important to have fun. And in that spirit, before I actually start speaking, I would like to refer you to my additional guest introducer. We have a special guest to introduce me a second time. And there he is.
Take a look at what crossed my desk right here this week. It's a little gem called U.S. v. Bush by Elizabeth de la Vega. This is a book by an activist, former prosecutor, who has concocted a criminal grand jury case against the Bush administration for allegedly misleading the American people into war. And it brings us to tonight's word. Case closed. Ms. de la Vega accuses the president and his team of conspiring to, quote, commit offense or to defraud the United States, a crime that's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The readers of this book are supposed to act as a grand jury. After reading multi-source testimony from public statements, we're expected to conclude that the Bush administration broke the law. Well, I have news for Ms. de la Vega. The only thing Americans like less than reading is jury duty. You see, she doesn't even accuse the president or his team of outright lying. Instead, she alleges that they used, quote, deceit, craft, trickery, dishonest means, false and fraudulent representations, while knowing and intending that their false and fraudulent representations would influence the public and the deliberations of Congress. Big deal. That's like holding in the NFL. You could call it on every play. Now, the evidence might seem compelling if you're some kind of fact fetishist. Like the fact that the aluminum tubes were not used for nuclear weapons programs, like there was no yellow cake from Niger, like there were no mobile weapons labs, the meeting between one of the 9/11 hijackers and an Iraqi spy chief never happened. Well, guess what, Ms. Della Vega? You wouldn't even know all those claims were false if we hadn't invaded and found no evidence for them. I say, open and shut. Even if Mr. Bush did everything that Ms. Della Vega says, we're talking about the President of the United States here. You can't accuse him of crimes. To support my case, I now call my surprise witness, President Richard Nixon. In an interview from 1977, President Nixon, has President Bush done anything illegal?
When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
No further questions. And that's the word. Folks, I only wish Ms. Della Vega had the balls to come on my show and defend her argument. But I know that's not going to happen. I'm sorry. Oh, that's happening? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elizabeth Della Vega. All right.
Thank you.
Madam, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, welcome to the rapport, where I am judge, jury, and executioner. So, did I characterize the nature of your book correctly?
Actually, you did a pretty good job. The problem is with your conclusion.
Wait,
and
you're saying I misjudged your book?
No, you got the book right. It's just your confusion and your conclusion that's the problem. And
Objection!
I know...
Sustained. Okay, make your case then.
Okay.
Make your case against the president. Hit
Well,
it.
the first thing you need to know is that it is, in fact, illegal for the president to violate the law. It is against the law for the president to violate the law.
Unless he has a signing statement next to that
Right.
law, and then he
Right.
can do anything he wants in relationship to that law because he says what it means.
Right. The second thing you need to know is that in this case, the president and his aides used the same techniques that the people used in the Enron case. They used half-truths. They deliberately misrepresented things like the 9/11 and Iraq. Did you know there really was not a connection between those two?
Well, I know my understanding is that there was a connection
Yeah,
between
well,
9/11
in fact,
and
there
Iraq.
wasn't.
Well, no,
All right.
I'm not talking about in
All
fact.
right.
I'm talking
Okay.
about my
Well, the
understanding of those two
fact.
things. Okay?
Right.
Guilty. All right. No, but there's no way that the president's ever going to be, charged with any of the crimes you're talking about. It's just not going to happen, right? This is just some sort of fancy folderol candy floss for fun.
No, this was not fun. Let me tell you, writing
No?
this book was not fun. But what this is a way of showing people that the president has committed a crime, and his aides, of course, including Vice President Cheney, which I guess is more than an aide. But in any case, they used the same techniques that the Enron fraud people did, and everybody was outraged, of course, about the Enron fraud. Were you outraged about that?
No, I was not.
All right.
Listen, that's just stocks and
It was
bonds.
no
You rolls
big
your
deal.
dice, you takes your chances, what I
Right,
say.
exactly,
Now,
exactly.
look, you say fraud here, okay?
Right, I
but
do say
if we're
fraud.
going to hold people, up for trial because they commit fraud, don't we need to hold that same standard against people, who create movie trailers?
No,
Because they mislead us into thinking it's going to be a good movie, and then you go and you find out that all the jokes and all the good fun stuff's in the beginning.
it's disappointing.
I want my money back from Beer Fest.
It is disappointing. But, well, I'll look into that. But the president and the vice president take an oath of office, and they're sworn, believe it or not, to uphold the laws and abide by the Constitution of the United States.
I know
Did you know that?
Don't patronize me.
All right.
No, so do you want to see the president
Okay.
impeached? Would you like to see the president impeached?
I think there are grounds for impeachment.
You'd
I
like
think
to
we
see
have
that
move
happen?
forward.
You'd like to see that
I
happen?
would like to see the hearings
Good, me
take
too.
place.
President Cheney, let's go, get on. Ladies,
Thank you.
gentlemen, I have rendered my judgment. The president is innocent. Elizabeth de la Vega, thank you.
De la Vega.
What?
De la Vega.
Objection! I will pronounce your name the way I wish to. Change it on the book is what I'm going to do.
Thank you.
Sit down!
Oh, all right.
We'll be right back.
I have to tell you that when I went out to the show, I had no idea he was going to do that. In fact, I actually had no idea what anything that was going to happen when I went on the show, but I was very happy to see him putting up my book cover all over the place. And it's very helpful because he really explains the book, and I can just take questions right now. No, actually, of course, it is a big deal. And as Peter told you, I worked as a prosecutor for over 20 years, and both in Minneapolis and in San Jose. And when I took early retirement, and it was very early, I want to say, it was just extremely premature. I finally had a chance to really look at the TV news. I never watched it before. And this was 2004, in the fall of 2004, and it was really an eye-opener because I had known in a very general way, of course, that the president had deceived us about the war, and I couldn't really figure out how it could be that anybody could not know that by that time. But when I saw the news, I realized why people in the United States had no idea about this, because all it was this back and forth shouting at each other and just a couple of words going one way and insults going the other way, and there was never any substantive discussion about anything. And to the extent there was any substantive discussion, it seemed about the weapons of mass destruction and the war intelligence in general, that the question always came down to, well, did the president lie about the grounds for war, and in particular about the weapons of mass destruction? And having worked as a prosecutor all those years, and I did a lot of fraud cases, it occurred to me that everybody's asking the wrong question, because when they talked about, well, did the president lie, even people who were critics of the president would say, well, I don't think he could have lied because he never knew anything. He didn't read anything. And somehow that was supposed to be okay. And the law of fraud isn't that easy to get around, and I thought it would be worthwhile, to the extent that anybody would want to read about it, to write about it. And so, especially since starting in late 2004, 2005, it was becoming increasingly apparent that none of these so-called commissions were going to be doing anything of any substance. We had Bush's WMD commission, and they specifically said that they weren't going to talk about how the president used the intelligence. So I'm really not even sure what the point of that was. And then we had the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and they had the two phases, and still today we haven't gotten that second phase about how the president used the intelligence. So I set about, it was kind of a quixotic effort that I really can't even explain myself right now, but I thought, well, I'll just do this. I'll do it the same way I did any fraud case. And people who see prosecutors on TV might think that it's a very glamorous job, but in fact, it's not. What prosecutors and actually most lawyers do is sit around in rooms and you look at these boxes of documents, and if you're a government lawyer, you're sitting in a room that has greenish, like sick green walls. And if you're a non-government lawyer, you're sitting in a nicer room, but you're still looking at these boxes of documents. So fortunately, I actually like looking at boxes of documents, and I suppose I missed them, and that's why I decided to start this project. But so what I did was I just set about to do this analysis in the same way I would do any other case. And the statute that came into my mind was conspiracy to defraud the United States, and Stephen Colbert very kindly put it up there for you, so I don't have to read it. But the Nixon case is important in thinking about that statute because it was actually used to prosecute H.R. Haldeman, who most of you do remember, as our first advertising executive who set about to basically ruin the government. And he was, for those of you who might not know, was Nixon's chief of staff, and he was responsible in large part for the cover-up, and he was charged with conspiring to interfere with the investigations of the Watergate burglary by interfering with the CIA and the FBI investigations. And so that charge was conspiracy to defraud the United States. Because a basic element of it is that you have to use deceit or craft or trickery to obstruct another branch of government or an agency of government. So in this case, my thinking was that Congress used to be a branch of government, and that that the actions of the president and his administration would be an interference with their duty to oversee foreign affairs and to authorize and declare war. So that was the basis for the beginning of my analysis. And then what I set about to do was to gather all the evidence I could find, first of all, of the behind-the-scenes activities. And in any fraud case, the key is to analyze the discrepancy between the public statements and actions versus what the people know or say or do behind the scenes. So I essentially gathered everything I could find about what did the president and his advisors have, what information did they have notice of behind the scenes. And the way I did that was I took the Senate Select Committee report, the Rob Silberman Commission report, the 9/11 Commission report, and of course most of those reports were fairly favorable towards the administration in the first place. But that's okay, because I wanted to do it in the most conservative way possible. And believe it or not, even though I did come out with a book indicting the president, I did want to do it in a conservative way. So I just took anything that was undisputed in those reports, nothing that depended on a particular witness, and I made a chronology. And that was the behind-the-scenes chronology, and I did that with a system around my house of papers piled up around the house, different tables. And so when I had the behind-the-scenes chronology, then I had to start using the floor in order to do the public one, and my dog seemed to really like some of those White House press briefings, but so for that part of the chronology, I went to the White House website and I read every press briefing from before 9/11, really, all the way through 2004, not the whole year, but part of the year. And also the Department of Defense and the State Department and the TV statements and so forth. And throughout this process, it was a little bit, well, it certainly was an isolated activity. There weren't a lot of human beings I talked to about it. But so I was kind of like somebody watching a sporting event, you know, where you yell at the TV. I would kind of yell at my computer reading about Ari Fleischer and Scott McClellan. And in fact, I got to the point where I kind of had this conflict between wanting to stand up and strangle Ari Fleischer and Scott McClellan, which is just a figure of speech if you're a Secret Service agent out there, and give the one person who was a hero in all this, and that was Helen Thomas. I wanted to jump up and give her a hug. And so in the strange world of the internet, I actually just decided I'll send her an email. So I did. I sent her an email and I said, "Dear Miss Thomas, I just wanted to tell you I'm going through this process." And I told her exactly what I just told you, that I wanted to give her a hug. And she wrote back and she said, Well, thank you very much, and she was very gracious, and she also said thank you for understanding the level of deceit that's being practiced by this administration. So when I finally, by the way, during all this time, I did not have a book contract. I didn't really know what was going to happen to all this crazy stuff I was doing. But when I finally did get one, I decided I wanted to honor Helen Thomas. And so my book starts off with, and I don't know if it's a preface or there's all these different words for pages that begin a book before you actually get to the book, but I guess it's the preface. And I have a little colloquy that involves her and Ari Fleischer, and it's September 3rd, 2002. Now, I want to take you back to that time. Most of you are obviously keenly aware of this whole chronology because you're actively involved and you're active and committed citizens. But one of the reasons that fraud succeeds so well, just in general, is that people can't keep track of all this stuff. And the reason we have fraud as a society, the law of fraud rather, is that it's in the government's interest, it's in the country's interest to protect people and to make it incumbent upon people in any position of authority, whether they're selling life insurance or selling a house repair contract or contracts for funeral home services or healthcare products, it doesn't matter, that they have an obligation to be truthful, to be honest with people, and also to look into the basis for what they're saying. That's the reason why we have the law of fraud. And but people are able to get away with fraud because, in part, people just don't have time to pay attention. We shouldn't have to be parsing out everything that people say, and that includes the President of the United States, because once he takes that oath of office, he's not just a politician anymore. He has a higher obligation, actually, than the average citizen, and he's required to obey the laws and uphold the Constitution of the United States. So, in September 2002, just to take you back then, that was, of course, right after the president was coming back from his trip to Crawford, where he goes around and cuts down the brush with a chainsaw, which seems really like a lot of fun to me, and drives around in the pickup truck. And during that month, many of you probably remember, this followed almost a whole year after 9/11, where increasingly the administration was kind of leaking out suggestions that they were going to be invading Iraq. And they started off by talking about Afghanistan as phase 1. They did that starting about September 20th, 2001, right after 9/11. And of course, if you have phase 1, people start thinking there's phase 2. But they never said there's going to be phase 2. And it was kind of the boiling frog technique. That was the beginning of it. You know, just start kind of getting people used to this idea that there's going to be another invasion without saying anything, and therefore keeping people from actually having a debate about it and discussing the pros and cons. And when you think about all this stuff, and I'm sure you're already thinking how this compares to the situation we have today in with regard to Iran, where you have Tony Snow saying it's an urban legend that the president is considering invading Iran, yet all the while they're starting to turn up the heat and boil all of us to get us used to the idea that they want to invade Iran. But so during that whole year, there had been information coming out. Cheney had been going around talking about this supposed meeting where the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, had met with the head of Iraqi surveillance in Prague, and he said it was pretty well confirmed. That was in December. He started saying that. Well, at that time, it hadn't even been investigated. And I can tell you, having been in law enforcement all those years, you can't say something's pretty well confirmed if it hasn't even been looked into. And he kept saying it, even though later on the FBI had actually disproved it. And they said there was evidence that Mohammed Atta had been in Florida during that time. And then you had Paul Wolfowitz out there saying the same thing. And one of the things I talk about in the book is he's saying, Paul Wolfowitz and Cheney are talking about this meeting and just generally implying that there's a link between Iraq and 9/11. But behind the scenes, Paul Wolfowitz was actually meeting with the Brits. And he said to them in one meeting, and the British were good about writing these memos. We don't have any memos from our own country, but I forget who it was, David Manning or something, one of the high officials in Britain, said he had a meeting with Paul Wolfowitz where Wolfowitz said, well, it seems like there has to be a connection between 9/11 and Iraq. Do you have any evidence of it? And so Manning was kind of incredulous that the United States was going around saying this, but they were wondering if there really was any evidence. And actually, after the fact, after the invasion, some right-wing talk show person asked Wolfowitz, well, when was it that you first realized there was no connection between 9/11 and Iraq? And Wolfowitz said, I don't think I ever thought there was a connection between 9/11 and Iraq. So that was all going on, this leaking out of information, getting people kind of used to the idea that there was going to be an invasion of Iraq. Yet at the same time, in this kind of bipolar approach they had to dealing with publicity, they were denying any suggestions that they were planning to invade Iraq. So in August, however, right before this little colloquy that I'm about to read you, Brent Scowcroft and Dick Armey, prominent Republicans, were out there saying, well, it sure looks like the president wants to invade Iraq, and it's not a good idea. There's no evidence to support it. There's no grounds for the war. It will create chaos. And boy, I wonder if that turned out to be true. So when the first press conference happened after the summer vacation, one of Bush's many, many vacations, on September 3rd, Ari Fleischer went to this press briefing, and the press was really ready to go after him. You know, essentially they were saying, well, what is going on here? Are we going to have a war in Iraq? But the real hero of it was Helen Thomas, and she started off, well, I'm not sure if she had the first question. You remember she used to get to ask the first question, and these folks decided that she was really an irritation, and more than an irritation, and they stuffed her in the back. And just as an aside, I have to say it was entirely appalling to me that anybody could treat a person of that age and experience and just someone who had made such a great contribution to this country with such disregard. It was just no class whatsoever. But so Helen Thomas said, Ari, is the president willing to prepare to sacrifice American and Iraqi innocent lives to take out Saddam Hussein? And Ari Fleischer said, Helen, and I always had the sense he always said it like that, Helen, the president is prepared to protect innocent lives. And Helen Thomas said, not surprisingly, pardon? And then Ari Fleischer said, the president is prepared to protect innocent lives. And that is why the president has said that Iraq is part of the axis of evil. Well, that makes sense. So what's interesting about that, apart from that it really doesn't make any sense at all, is that what followed, again, is eerily reminiscent of what we're hearing today, because Helen Thomas, not one to give up easily, said, well, isn't the president's mission going to lead to the loss of hundreds of thousands of innocent lives? And Ari Fleischer said, mission? What mission? And she said, well, isn't the president planning to invade Iraq? Helen, the president is going to have a consultation with the American people, and he's going to have a dialogue with the world about the war in Iraq. Now, have you heard that lately? Too. So I think that this September 3rd day is a good day to begin just a little kind of window into how this fraud worked. And I've decided to call it 6 Days in September. That's going to be my movie. about this book. But so September 3rd is the first day. And another thing that you should know is that as of this time, the polls showed that the public really wasn't supporting this war. But they supported it more. They were more likely to support it if they thought the president really was going to have a dialogue with the American people, and if the president was going to go to Congress to get approval, and if the president was going to go to the UN. In other words, if the decision was going to be made as part of a democratic process. But that was not something that the president really subscribed to. On the other hand, he was all over the idea that he had to make it look like it was part of a democratic process. So September 4th was the day that the president announced, guess what? I'm having an open dialogue with the American people. And so what he did on that day, and in these press briefings and the transcripts, I tried occasionally to actually count the number of times these different themes would come up, and I had all these lists of themes, and I realized that this was going to drive me nuts because there were so many repetitions. But with this one, it was pretty easy, because what the president did is he had, I think, about a 5-minute conversation in the Oval Office with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and then they all came out and they sat. And he said to all the press corps, I'm having an open dialogue with Congress. It's a bipartisan group. Here's the Democrats and here's the Republicans. And in a 7-minute press conference, he said 7 times something along the lines of this open dialogue. And here we are, we're talking now, and we're all good people talking. And so, of course, that was a 5-minute conversation about whether to invade Iraq. What's even worse about that day, September 4th, 2002, was that all the while the administration had been leaking out these hints about and getting people to subscribe to the idea kind of subliminally that we should invade Iraq. These are just a few of the things that had already happened, and many of you already know these things. But as of September 4th, 2002, we had been attacking Iraq for a very long time. The president had started, quite famously at this point, and Donald Rumsfeld had started looking for evidence. Some of you probably saw the little memo where he told his aide, Stephen Cambone, go massive, sweep it up, look for everything to do with Iraq. They thought Iraq was a better target than Afghanistan. There were more things they could hit. On September 17th, the president asked for a preliminary plan to invade Iraq. On November 21st, he asked for a formal plan to invade Iraq, and they got Tommy Franks to come back. And I don't know why I call him Tommy Franks, because I do not know him. But I guess we all call him Tommy Franks. And he came back from Afghanistan week after week, and Rumsfeld kept telling him, well, this plan that you're giving me is not, you can't execute it quickly enough, so you got to come up with a faster one. And this is, by the end of December, they'd already gone through 5 revisions of just the first plan. And this was the man who was supposed to be heading up the invasion of Afghanistan, of course, looking for Osama bin Laden, but that didn't matter to the president. And at the same time, they took this group called the Screaming Eagles, which is not a rock group. It's a military unit, and they're highly trained in Pashtun and Arabic languages, and they're also special forces. They moved them from Afghanistan to Iraq. They put the CIA over there and got them going. They, of course, Cheney went over to the Middle East and went to the 10 countries that circumvent, or I don't know what the word is, but the 10 countries that are around Iraq. And when Condoleezza Rice was asked about why he was going on Meet the Press, I think it was, she said, oh, he's just going over there because he's got a lot of friends over there. Right. And then, of course, President Bush went over to Europe to get support for the war. And then in June, Rumsfeld was over there getting support for the war. And by the end of June, Donald Rumsfeld had approved 50 airstrikes that were likely to kill more than 30 Iraqi civilians. They had to get approval. That was the rule. If it was more than 29, apparently that was significant enough for Rumsfeld to have to approve them, and he did, 50 of them. If the strike was considered to be likely to kill fewer than 30 people, they didn't have to have Rumsfeld approve it. So I don't know how many of those were. In July of 2002, the United States, or Bush, without talking to Congress, without even, of course, not asking approval, but not even mentioning it to Congress, moved $700 million from the funds for Afghanistan to Iraq funds for preparation for the war. So, and by September, we had 40,000 troops over there. We had 350,000 tons of munitions. We had, we were ready. We were already engaged in the war. And so that was September 4th. But meanwhile, we're starting the open dialogue. So September 5th was another significant day, because on that day, in the course of writing this book, when I did talk to some human beings once in a while, I talked to a man named Tim Goodrich, who's the founder of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And he's a young man, and he joined the military when he was 18. And he told me specifically, I didn't join the military because I had no other choice. I joined it because I really thought it was a patriotic thing to do. I wanted to help the country. And he was in Qatar on September 5th, and he was involved in tech support for the largest airstrikes we'd had against Iraq since 1998. And he heard the president with this open dialogue speech, and then he was involved in these attacks, and he said that he knew then that the president was deceiving us and deceiving the world. He said it was the ultimate betrayal. He said he was engaged in a consultation, but there we were bombing the hell out of him, is what he said. And I'm sorry I'm at the pulpit saying that, but so that was September 5th. Now, remember I mentioned before that the conspiracy to defraud the United States has to be to interfere with a branch of government. And how do we know that the administration was deliberately setting out to use deceit to interfere with a branch of government? Well, we know it because on September 6th, Karl Rove and Andy Card, the former chief of staff, were interviewed by the New York Times. And they, in a sign of how blatant this administration has really been, and they're increasingly so every day, but they said, we are going to roll out the plan, our marketing plan for the war, and we are aiming it at Congress and the American public in order to convince Congress to authorize military force. And they said, we're going to get the authorization within 5 to 6 weeks before the election, and in the end, this was Karl Rove, he said, it will be difficult for any member of Congress to vote against this authorization. So in criminal cases, people talk about smoking guns, and there really are almost never smoking guns, even if they're actually guns. But in the context of this case, that interview was like a smoking gun, because they deliberately, they admitted that they were setting about to interfere with the branch of government, Congress, by going in this two-pronged way towards the public and Congress at the same time. And of course, if they had told the truth, if they had told the reasons why they wanted to invade Iraq, and we may never know all the reasons, but in the book I do lay out the genesis, really, of some of these ideas about Project for New American Century that many of you know about, and ideas about wanting global preeminence, which when people talked about at that time, when they mentioned, anybody deigned to mention that these were the ideas of people in the administration, they were considered to be crazy. But those are in fact actually the words of the people in the administration, dating back to 1992, and also having a permanent force presence in Iraq and of course in the Middle East rather, and the oil. And another reason, which, and one thing about this book, by the way, is I don't reach a conclusion. The reader can decide, although it's fairly obvious what my conclusion is. But the evidence is just laid out in a way that anybody can decide for themselves. But one piece of evidence that's in here has to do with Bush himself, and I'm sure some of you have heard of this, but in May 1999, the president was interviewed by a man named Mickey Herskovitz, who was a family friend. I don't think he is anymore since this information came out. But Bush said, one of the keys to being seen as a great leader is to be seen as a commander-in-chief. He also said, my father had all this political capital built up when he drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and he wasted it. He just wasted it. If I have a chance to invade, if I had that much capital, I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to get everything passed that I want to get passed, and I'm going to have a successful presidency. It's working well, isn't it? So, in any case, if the administration had gone out and talked about its motives for wanting to start the war, or if it had talked about the true state of the evidence that supported its arguments for the war, that wouldn't have been a conspiracy to defraud. But as we know, and as was evidenced the very next day after Karl Rove and Andy Card made this statement, which would be the 5th day of our 6 days in September, that was September 7th, they did nothing of the kind. And in fact, Bush and Blair on that day were in Crawford, Texas. And by the way, anybody who suggests to you that all of this is just a big mistake need really only look at the level of orchestration and really Machiavellian planning that went into, you could just look at these 6 days. And there's obviously no question that none of this is a mistake. Clearly, it's not a mistake if you say you're in an open dialogue and you know you've been involved in the war for close to a year. But on September 7th, Blair and Bush were in Crawford, Texas, and they made an announcement as to why they knew that there were nuclear weapons in Iraq. And they said that just recently, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, came out with a report that said that Iraq was 6 months away from having nuclear weapons. Well, that's interesting, because the IAEA hadn't even been there since 1998, and when they did have a report, that report said nothing of the kind. In fact, it said that the programs had been destroyed. So you can call that, in the language of fraud, you can call it a statement made with reckless disregard for the truth, or you can just call it an outright lie. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but it's clearly an intentional deceit. And one would think, well, how can you get away with something that's so flatly false? Well, as the president and this administration has well known all along, they can make these statements. They go out over Fox News. They get reported everywhere. And even if they're called on it, even if corrections are called to their attention, or even publicly, they're not called to the public's attention in the same way as the original statements, not even close. So the majority of people just hear the first part, and they don't know anything about the follow-up. Because again, who has time to parse and cross-examine all the statements that are being made by the chief executive of the United States? So that was September 7th. And one of the developments that I trace in the book is that when the administration first started out, they were just kind of making generally false statements, like Iraq is a grave and gathering danger. Well, that wasn't true, because at that time the National Intelligence Estimate said, really said almost nothing about Iraq. And, but people were saying, well, where's your evidence? You know, where's the beef, really? And so September 8th is when they decided to come out with some specifics. And as everybody knows, the American people were not going to sign on to a war against Iraq based just on chemical weapons or biological weapons. They had to come up with something about the nuclear weapons. And they had two things. They had the uranium from Niger, and which I don't go into in the book, but there's been a lot out there about it, still is. But the other one were these aluminum tubes. And many of you probably remember on September 8th, it was a Sunday, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Cheney, and General Myers were on 5 different talk shows that morning. And the first thing they did, which is astounding to me, is that they all relied or purported to rely on an article that had been in the New York Times that very morning, as if, all of a sudden, we just found out that there's this evidence that would justify what we've been saying all along, which is that there are weapons of mass destruction, which is just an odd position for the administration to take. But what they said was, and Condoleezza Rice said in particular, we know that there's a nuclear weapons program because the Iraqis are trying to get these tubes, these aluminum tubes that are only suitable, she said, for use in nuclear centrifuge to make enriched uranium. And at that time, and this is something I tracked in great detail when I was doing the research, based on the Senate Select Report, we already know, and the Rob Silberman Commission report, we know that as of that time, available to the administration were 14 different reports about these aluminum tubes. They were from the Defense Investigative Agency, the CIA, the Department of Energy experts, our own experts from Lawrence Livermore and Oak Ridge, and also from Colin Powell's own experts, the intelligence analysts. And out of the 14, and these have been going back and forth since April of 2001, even before 9/11, they knew about these tubes. And they actually had some of them. And one interesting thing about them is that they were actually buying them on the internet. So it's clearly not a really clandestine effort. And they were haggling about the price. We don't want to pay that much. And again, not really something you do if you're trying to be secretive. But beyond that, the tubes themselves were 3 feet long, and the tubes that could be used for these nuclear centrifuges were a foot long. So they're 3 times as long, and you could say, well, okay, they could cut them. They can make them shorter. They were coated, anodized. Well, you can't use those for the enriched uranium work. So you could say, okay, well, they could get rid of the coating. They were also too thick. They were about 3 times as thick as they were supposed to be. Well, okay, you could machine that down. They were made out of aluminum, and that was probably the least up-to-date kind of material that you would use for that kind of centrifuge work. And in fact, in the early 90s, the Iraqis had a much stronger metal that they were using for the tube. So it was an inferior quality metal. And finally, the diameter was 3 1/4 inches, but the tubes that were suitable for the nuclear centrifuges were about 1 inch. So you can't make the diameter smaller. And in fact, out of these 12 reports, out of the 14, 12 of them said it's highly controversial whether they could ever be used for nuclear weapons use at all. And out of those, half of them, a good half, and those are the ones from the Lawrence Livermore people and Colin Powell's own people, and they said they are highly unsuitable. So in the end, what we had, as we all know, after September 8th, it was about 5 weeks until the authorization for military force was passed. And people say, well, Congress should have known better and the information was out there. Well, a lot of it was, and it's true, Congress should have known better. But that doesn't, in the context of fraud, that doesn't get the people off the hook who were actually the perpetrators of the fraud and the instigators of the whole plan. And even as to that, another insidious thing that the administration did was that they didn't even want a new national intelligence estimate. Can you imagine? You decide we're going to go to war, but we don't really need an up-to-date national intelligence estimate. We're just going to go out there and say whatever we want. Congress asked for one, and it was rushed through, and it was submitted to Congress 10 hours before the vote. It was classified. People had to look at it in one place under guard, and the only thing that was declassified was a 25-page white paper that completely misrepresented what was in the national intelligence estimate, which in and of itself was misleading and more favorable to the administration's case. So anybody who actually read it, any congressperson, couldn't say anything publicly to explain why he or she was against the war in the first place. So that's another part of the fraud. So in the end, what they did, the administration deceived the people about their decision, a timing of their decision to go to war, their reasons for wanting to go to war. As we now know painfully clearly, they deceived the American people and suppressed information about the expected costs of the war. They had that information, but anybody who deigned to say it publicly was attacked, and I don't know where they put them, but they put them somewhere. General Shinseki, who talked about the number of troops that would be needed for occupation, he was put out to pasture. And the last thing, or the final category of deceit, had to do with the UN process. Now, throughout 2001, after 9/11 through 2002, the administration was talking with the British. They were consulting, but they weren't consulting about whether to go to war. They were consulting about how to get the public and the public in the world to go along with the war. And so these memos are actually in here, and the conversations are very blatant. The British were saying there are no grounds for this war. This is an illegal war. But here's an idea. Let's think of a way to get Saddam Hussein to look bad, as if he didn't already look bad. But we'll go to the UN, and we will get the inspectors over there. And the United States didn't want to do that. And really the only reason we didn't go to war earlier was because the British were saying, you really have to do this. And they called it wrong footing. And so one of the agents, who's really me, they're all me in here, there's fictional agents, but says the issue is to wrong foot or not to wrong foot. That was the only question that was discussed. But unfortunately, Iraq didn't really cooperate with the Bush administration's plan, which was that they were not supposed to cooperate with the inspectors. So, does everybody follow that? They didn't cooperate with the plan not to cooperate. And so, one thing I did not realize until I looked at the website was just how quickly and vocally the administration came out right away. When they went to the UN in September, almost a couple of days later, Saddam Hussein said, well, we are going to cooperate. And up on the White House website was this thing, well, who can trust the Iraqis? You know, they say they're going to cooperate, but we can't trust them. And there are all these talking points. And of course, where do they go? To Fox News. You know, the canned stories for Fox News. So by the time that the president actually announced the invasion that had already been happening all along in March, a couple of days before, the night before, that was his final lie, not his final lie in the sense of the years, but just in this time span. And he said, we have to invade Iraq because they're not cooperating with the inspectors. And of course, at that time, Hans Blix was literally begging the United States not to invade Iraq. And so what we ended up here with, and the reason I wrote this book, is that we have a fraud that's far, far worse than the Enron fraud, far worse than anything you can possibly imagine. And it's not, obviously, all of you people know as well as I do, it's not a victimless crime. We have hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed in Iraq, and it's a measure of how little the United States really even thinks about that, because we don't even bother to count how many people there are. We have all the soldiers who've been killed. We have 2 million people who've been displaced out of Iraq, which I understand is proportionately the equivalent of the whole state of California population in the context of the United States. And all of this really amounts to something that is almost indescribable, and yet nothing has been done about it. And Hubert Humphrey, our favorite son here, said that the measure of a society, he said it better than I'm going to, but is how well it treats the humblest of its citizens. And I think the other side of the coin is true as well. The measure of the society is how well, or how, not how well, but how it treats the most powerful. And the issue is, do we treat the most powerful the same as we treat the most humble? And when I was a law clerk, I clerked for a judge who had his chambers next to Judge Devitt. Devitt, some of you might know who that is, and he was a courtly old gentleman, and he actually wrote jury instructions. He wrote a book, and one of the main ones was said that the law, juries are always told this, I think they're told it in more modern language now, but the law is no respecter of persons, which means not that the law doesn't respect persons, but rather that it doesn't matter who you are. And obviously that's the bedrock of our whole criminal justice system, that you treat everybody the same regardless of who they are. So in the Enron case, Catherine Remler, who was the prosecutor, told the jury regarding these powerful CEOs, she said, it was not Ken Lay's Enron, it was not Jeffrey Skilling's Enron, it was the investors' Enron, it was the employees' Enron, and there wasn't just one set of facts for inside the boardroom and another set of facts for outside the boardroom. And the people were entitled to have true and complete and honest information about the state of Enron in order to make their decisions about their important investments. And the same is true here. It's not President Bush's United States, and it's not Vice President Cheney's United States. And there's not one set of facts for inside the Oval Office and another set of facts for outside the Oval Office. And the people of the United States are entitled to true and complete and full information about whether or not to go to war against a people 8,000 miles away who have done absolutely nothing to us. And that's why I believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that we have to hold these people accountable. Thank you.